There's a quiet truth about relationships that most people only begin to understand as they grow older. The quality of the people you attract is often a reflection of the person you are becoming. Many people move through life asking the same questions. Why do I always attract emotionally unavailable people? Why do my relationships feel exhausting? Or why do truly meaningful connections seem so rare? But according to sociologist McPherson and the theory of homophily, the answer often goes much deeper than luck or timing. Homophily is the idea that human beings naturally gravitate toward people who are similar to them. Similar in mindset, similar in emotional patterns, similar in values, lifestyle, ambition, emotional maturity, and even the way they see the world. In simple terms, people tend to connect with those who feel psychologically familiar, and this completely changes the way we understand attraction, because high-quality relationships rarely happen by accident. Most of the time, they reflect the emotional environment a person carries within themselves. The people who remain in your life often mirror your standards, your self-worth, your emotional state, and the level of inner growth you have reached. That is why someone who constantly lives in emotional chaos often finds themselves drawn to unstable relationships. Someone who secretly fears abandonment may unconsciously feel attracted to emotionally inconsistent people. And someone who has not fully recognized their own value may continue accepting connections that slowly destroy their peace. Not because they deserve less, but because human beings naturally move toward what feels familiar, even when that familiarity hurts them. That is the deeper meaning behind like attracts like. Homophily is not simply about having similar interests or backgrounds. It operates on a much deeper level. The way people process emotions, the way they respond to pain, the way they treat themselves when nobody is watching, and the level of emotional maturity they carry into everyday life. This is why people with strong character often begin attracting very different kinds of relationships over time. A woman with depth does not need to chase attention everywhere she goes. The way she speaks, the boundaries she protects, the peace she refuses to sacrifice, and the standards she quietly lives by already create a unique emotional presence around her. Over time, that energy naturally filters out shallow connections and attracts people who operate on a similar emotional frequency. Because emotionally mature people cannot stay attracted to chaos forever. A grounded man eventually loses interest in manipulation, inconsistency, and emotionally unstable dynamics. Someone with purpose naturally feels more connected to people who also have direction in life, and people who value growth tend to feel safer around those who possess self-awareness, discipline, and emotional stability. That is why your environment matters far more than most people realize. The people around you quietly shape your mindset, habits, standards, and even the way you see yourself. If you remain too long in environments filled with negativity, disrespect, or emotional instability, your nervous system slowly begins treating that as normal. But when you surround yourself with people who value growth, integrity, discipline, and emotional intelligence, your inner world also begins changing in healthier ways. That is the true power of homophily. You do not attract people only through beauty, charm, or communication skills. You attract through the emotional standard you live in every single day, through the way you treat yourself, through what you tolerate, through the peace you protect, and through the life you quietly build even when nobody is watching. Interestingly, the more people focus on building themselves, the less they feel the need to chase relationships. Because as inner value rises, incompatible connections naturally begin falling away. And little by little, the right people start appearing almost effortlessly. Not because of luck or magic, but because human beings naturally seek spaces where they feel emotionally and psychologically aligned. So perhaps the real goal is not desperately trying to find the right person, Perhaps the deeper goal is becoming the kind of person whose energy naturally belongs in the kind of relationships you truly wish to experience. 1. The nature of homophily. The first thing to understand about homophily is that people do not form deep connections simply because of physical attraction, excitement, or temporary emotions. Those things may create initial attention, but for a relationship to truly last, human beings usually need something much deeper, a sense of alignment in values and the way they see life. That is why some people meet for the first time and immediately feel naturally connected. The conversation flows effortlessly. Their mindset feels compatible. Their emotional rhythm matches. And the more time they spend together, the more understood they feel without constantly needing to explain themselves. Meanwhile, there are also relationships that feel intensely exciting at first, yet over time become emotionally exhausting, disconnected, and difficult to sustain. According to McPherson, this is not accidental. Human beings naturally gravitate toward people who reflect similar values and inner emotional patterns. We tend to feel safer around those who see the world in ways similar to us, who share comparable standards, and who carry an energy our nervous system recognizes as familiar. That is also why true character has never been something that can be built through appearances or a few impressive words. Character is formed through the way a person lives every day, through what they tolerate, what they refuse, the way they keep promises, the way they behave when nobody is watching, and the way they face difficulties without losing their dignity. What is fascinating is that these qualities always send signals, even when someone is not trying to display them. In sociology, this is known as value-based signaling, the system through which people communicate their values without explicitly saying them. Human beings constantly reveal themselves through the way they speak, the way they handle pressure, their level of discipline, emotional stability, personal taste, and even the way they treat others. And people who operate on similar levels of value often recognize each other very quickly without needing much performance or self-promotion. A person with depth can usually sense who is emotionally shallow. Someone with a growth mindset naturally feels drawn toward others who are also committed to self-development. And a person with inner peace will often struggle to maintain long-term closeness with those who constantly live in emotional chaos and drama. That is why people with real character rarely need to try too hard to impress others. They do not need to constantly talk about their value or prove how special they are. The way they live already becomes the clearest signal of who they are. The right people naturally recognize it, and those who are not aligned with that level of value often feel out of sync and gradually drift away on their own. This also explains why, as people mature, they become less attracted to relationships built only on intense emotions or surface-level attraction. After enough life experience, what truly makes someone want to stay is often peace, emotional alignment, and the ability to feel fully themselves around another person. Because deep down, what human beings are truly searching for is not just attraction. What they are really searching for is the feeling of, this person understands the world in a way that feels like mine. And that is the real foundation behind relationships that can last for a very long time without needing constant effort to hold each other together. 2. Why do aligned people naturally attract each other? One of the most fascinating aspects of homophily is that when people meet someone who operates on the same level of values and emotional depth, the connection often feels incredibly natural. There is no excessive effort, no need to constantly impress, no pressure to explain who you are or prove your worth just to feel understood. everything feels lighter. In psychology and behavioral science, this relates to a concept known as cognitive alignment. Compatibility in the way people think, process emotions, and interpret the world. When two individuals share similar values, emotional maturity, and life rhythms, the brain recognizes that harmony very quickly. And that recognition creates an almost immediate sense of comfort in each other's presence. That is why sometimes you meet someone for the first time, and the conversation flows effortlessly. You do not feel the need to perform or appear more interesting than you are. You are not overthinking every word before speaking. You do not feel pressured to become a different version of yourself just to be liked. You simply feel free to be yourself, and that feeling is far rarer than most people realize. On the other hand, when we spend time around people who operate on completely different levels of values, the nervous system often senses the mismatch immediately. Conversations feel forced. You constantly adjust yourself just to maintain harmony. You find yourself explaining things that should not need explanation. Or worse, you notice your energy slowly draining after every interaction. This does not necessarily mean one person is right and the other is wrong. It simply means that human beings struggle to form deep connections with people whose worldview fundamentally conflicts with their own. Someone who values personal growth will often struggle to maintain closeness with someone who lacks direction. A person who deeply values peace may feel emotionally exhausted around constant drama and instability. And emotionally mature people eventually lose attraction to manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional games. That is why truly healthy relationships feel very different. They do not make you constantly question whether you are good enough. They do not force you to chase validation, and they do not leave you feeling as though you must continuously prove your value. Instead, the right connection often creates a feeling of calmness and emotional ease, a feeling that you no longer need to perform. This is also something many people misunderstand about attraction. They assume relationships filled with emotional intensity, unpredictability, and emotional highs and lows must be signs of deep love. But in reality, much of that intensity often comes from insecurity and emotional incompatibility. When two people are genuinely aligned, the relationship is usually quieter, more stable, more peaceful. There is a natural sense of being understood without constantly fighting to be seen. Because when we meet someone who truly shares our emotional and psychological level, the brain no longer needs to remain in a constant state of defense or overanalysis. The nervous system begins to feel safe. And from that safety, people naturally become more open, trusting, and emotionally connected. That is why people who are truly aligned often attract each other in very natural ways. Not because they desperately search for one another, but because the way they live, grow, and see the world gradually places them on the same emotional frequency. And when that happens, connection no longer feels like trying hard to be loved. Instead, it feels like, I finally met someone who understands the world inside me. 3. Where you find people who truly match your level. One of the biggest mistakes people make in relationships is believing they need to constantly search for the right person. But according to HOMOPHILY theory, meaningful relationships rarely appear through desperate searching. They emerge when you begin placing yourself in the right environments, spaces where your values are naturally practiced, expressed, and strengthened. In other words, instead of exhausting yourself trying to find high-quality people everywhere, the deeper goal is learning how to stand in the right places. Because the environments you spend your time in quietly determine the kind of people who eventually enter your life. If someone spends most of their life in environments filled with chaos, superficiality, and emotional instability, it becomes very difficult to build deep and mature connections. But when a person consistently places themselves in spaces with higher standards of thinking, emotional intelligence, and self-development, they naturally begin encountering people who carry similar energy. The first type of environment is intellectual spaces. These are places where people gather to learn, grow, and expand their thinking. It could be advanced classes, libraries, workshops, academic communities, or any environment where people genuinely care about personal growth and intellectual depth. What is fascinating is that people who love learning often carry a very different kind of energy. They are curious, reflective, and constantly seeking to improve themselves. And when you spend time in those environments, you do not only grow personally, you also increase the chances of meeting people who share a similar mindset and long-term perspective on life. The second type is disciplined spaces. Places like gyms, sports communities, training environments, or any space that requires consistency and perseverance often reveal a great deal about a person's character. Because discipline is not only about physical appearance, it reflects self-control, resilience, and the willingness to take responsibility for one's own life. That is why disciplined people often recognize each other naturally. They are not connecting only through appearances, but through a shared mindset, the mindset of people who choose growth instead of constantly blaming circumstances. The third type is aesthetic spaces, environments connected to art, culture, and emotional depth. This could include art galleries, quiet cafes, concerts, creative communities, or any place where people gather to truly experience beauty instead of simply consuming temporary entertainment. People with emotional depth and refined taste often experience the world differently. They are sensitive to energy, beauty, subtlety, and the emotional quality of human interaction. And in those environments, you are far more likely to meet people who move through life more thoughtfully, more deeply, and with greater emotional awareness. The fourth type is spaces of responsibility. High-pressure environments where people are forced to mature. This could be professional workplaces, ambitious projects, leadership communities, or any environment that demands accountability, emotional stability, and inner strength. Pressure has a way of revealing people's true character, and emotionally mature individuals are often shaped in environments that require them to regulate emotions, solve problems, and remain stable even under stress. That is why these spaces often attract people with stronger character, greater emotional depth, and a deeper sense of responsibility. And finally, there are quiet spaces, smaller but higher quality communities. As people mature, they often begin distancing themselves from overly loud environments and start seeking more meaningful forms of connection. This could be a small group built around shared values, a self-development community, or simply a few close friends with whom silence feels comfortable rather than awkward. Interestingly, people with genuine character are rarely found in the loudest places. They are usually present in more intentional environments, places where people are not trying to compete for attention, but are simply living more authentically. And this is where homophily becomes most powerful. Because when you place yourself in the right environments, you no longer need to desperately attract the right people. The way you live, the way you grow, and the places you choose to spend your time will naturally bring people of similar values into your life. 4. How character is built. Many people believe that character is something a person is simply born with. But in reality, character is not an inborn talent or an image carefully created to impress others. It is built through small choices repeated consistently every single day. Through the way a person behaves when nobody is watching, through the promises they keep to themselves, through the way they respond when emotions become intense, and through the things they are willing to walk away from in order to protect their peace and personal values. That is why true character is always connected to consistency. Because anyone can appear calm when life is easy. Anyone can talk about standards, self-worth, and values during comfortable moments. But what truly reveals a person is how they behave under pressure, during emotional chaos, or when they are forced to choose between what is easy and what is right. A person with strong character is not someone who is perfect. They still experience sadness, disappointment, exhaustion, and emotional pain like everyone else. But what makes them different is that they do not allow temporary emotions to control their entire life. They learn how to pause before reacting. They learn how to observe themselves before acting. And they learn how to remain grounded even during the moments when it would be easiest to lose themselves. That is why one of the clearest signs of character is the ability to avoid impulsive reactions. Most decisions people regret are made in moments of emotional intensity. When angry, they say things that wound others. When lonely, they return to relationships they already know are unhealthy. When afraid of abandonment, they sacrifice their self-respect just to keep someone from leaving. But people with inner strength understand that emotions are temporary states, and not every emotion deserves to become an action. Character is also built through the ability to say no. No to environments that slowly damage who you are becoming. No to relationships that constantly disturb your inner peace. No to sacrificing your values simply to feel accepted or included somewhere. And this is not easy. Human beings naturally crave connection and belonging. Many people stay in environments that no longer fit them simply because they fear loneliness. They hold on to relationships that emotionally ended long ago because familiarity feels safer than change. But the paradox is that the longer people cling to the wrong connections, the harder it becomes to find the right ones. That is why people with strong character eventually accept a very mature truth. Having fewer relationships that are genuine is far more valuable than being surrounded by many shallow ones. As people grow emotionally, they begin realizing that not everyone who enters their life is meant to stay forever. Some relationships exist only for a certain chapter. Some people only matched an older version of who they used to be. And sometimes, real growth begins the moment you become self-aware enough to leave environments that no longer align with the person you are becoming. What is interesting is that true character is rarely loud. It is not about constantly proving how deep, wise, or mature you are. People with genuine depth are often very calm. They do not constantly seek validation because their sense of worth is built internally rather than dependent on other people's reactions. And over time, that consistency quietly changes a person's entire life. It changes the way they see themselves. It changes the standards they hold in relationships. It changes the environments they choose to remain in. And eventually, it changes the kind of people they naturally attract into their life. Because character has never been about appearance or social image. It is an energy built through thousands of small choices a person quietly makes every single day. And those choices ultimately determine who you are becoming and what kind of people will one day feel deeply connected to you. 5. Why true compatibility often arrives late? One of the most confusing experiences in relationships is realizing that truly meaningful connections often arrive much later than expected. While people around you seem to constantly enter relationships, quickly find new partners, or always have someone beside them, those with deeper standards and emotional maturity often spend long periods of time alone. And during those periods, many people begin doubting themselves. They wonder if they are too selective, too distant, or simply too different to ever be truly understood. But from the perspective of homophily, this delay is usually not a punishment. It is a natural filtering process, because relationships that are truly aligned are rarely built on initial attraction alone. They require time to reveal consistency in behavior, depth of values, and the emotional maturity of both people involved. A person with strong character does not open their heart easily just because emotions feel intense in the beginning. They observe how someone reacts under pressure. They notice how that person treats others when there is nothing to gain. They pay attention to how someone keeps promises, handles responsibility, and maintains emotional stability over time. Because anyone can appear attractive in the beginning, but only time reveals who a person truly is. That is why truly compatible people often arrive much later than shallow connections. Not because they are impossibly rare, but because they are also careful about who they allow into their lives. What is interesting is that emotionally mature people are rarely deeply impressed by novelty or short-term excitement for very long. They care more about stability, emotional safety, and the ability to genuinely build a life together. And those things cannot be measured through a few conversations or a few weeks of emotional intensity. That is why patience becomes such an important part of high-quality relationships. Not passive patience that waits for someone to rescue you from loneliness, but the calm ability to continue building your own life without rushing to fill emotional emptiness with the wrong connections. And this is where many people struggle. Because when loneliness lasts too long, people often begin lowering their standards simply to feel connected to someone. They accept half-hearted relationships, emotionally unavailable people, or connections they already know deep down are not right for them. Not because they fail to recognize the problem, but because emptiness can sometimes make people fear being alone more than being with the wrong person. But the paradox is that every time we hold on to the wrong connection, we unconsciously fill our emotional space with something that does not truly belong there. And when the mind, emotions, and energy are already occupied by the wrong people, it becomes very difficult for the right relationships to enter. That is why maturity is sometimes less about learning how to hold on to relationships and more about learning how to leave the right spaces empty. Empty for personal growth, empty for inner peace, and empty for the possibility of truly aligned people to eventually appear. A person with strong character understands that temporary loneliness is far less dangerous than losing themselves inside relationships that slowly drain their soul. They are willing to move more slowly, choose more carefully, and sometimes live differently from the crowd because they understand that anything truly valuable requires time to be built properly. And that is ultimately why genuine compatibility often arrives late. Not because life is withholding happiness from you, but because deep connections usually require time for both people to become the versions of themselves they were meant to be before they are finally ready to meet each other. Ultimately, the most important message behind homophily theory is not about learning how to attract more people into your life. The deeper message is about becoming grounded enough that you never lose yourself inside the wrong relationships. Many people enter love wanting to be chosen. They reshape themselves to fit others, trying to become easier to accept, easier to love, and less difficult simply to avoid being left behind. But the paradox is that the further people move away from their authentic selves in order to maintain connection, the more likely they are to attract relationships that leave them feeling emotionally disconnected in the long run. Because lasting relationships are never built through constant self-abandonment and endless adaptation. They are built through genuine alignment in values, emotional depth, and the way two people experience life. And that kind of alignment can only exist when someone is honest enough to fully live as themselves. That is why true character has never been about appearing superior or trying to seem extraordinary. Character is the ability to remain connected to yourself in a world constantly pushing people to seek validation. It is the ability to maintain standards even during loneliness, to protect dignity even during emotional chaos, and to preserve inner peace instead of rushing into relationships simply to fill temporary emptiness. A person with real character is rarely in a hurry when it comes to relationships, not because they are cold or afraid of love, but because they understand that choosing the wrong person can slowly pull someone away from the best version of themselves. The wrong environment, the wrong connection, and unhealthy relationships always have the power to quietly reshape the way people see themselves, lower their standards, and normalize things they should never have accepted. That is why true maturity is sometimes less about learning how to keep someone and more about learning how to recognize who no longer belongs on the path you are walking. When someone begins building character, they also begin changing the entire way they connect with the world. They are no longer deeply attracted to intense but unstable emotions. They stop clinging to relationships that constantly disturb their peace, and they no longer see being alone as failure, because they understand that temporary loneliness is often a very small price to pay in order to protect a life that is truly aligned. What is fascinating is that when someone genuinely lives according to their values, they no longer need to desperately try to attract the right person. Their emotional stability, consistency, and depth naturally become a filter. The wrong people gradually drift away, and the right people feel emotionally connected without forced effort. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of having character. Not to make others admire you, not to appear exceptional in someone else's eyes, but to ensure that you never lose yourself simply because you are too afraid of losing a relationship. Because in the end, the right person will never love you for becoming someone else. The deepest connection will always happen when you are calm enough to fully live as your true self. If you've stayed until this point, perhaps you're also on the journey of becoming a more peaceful and valuable version of yourself. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.